Boom. Pleasant night, everyone here on Facebook Land. And tonight, I'm actually coming on live here where we're actually going to be exploring something in particular that most people are struggling with. And I think the information I want to share tonight would be of a lot of assistance to any and everyone in particular that is actually struggling with feeling spiritually stuck. Persons who may have been experiencing really some sort of religious trauma, no matter the magnitude or the extensiveness of what you're experiencing. This is actually specific to you. And if you're actually one of those who have pretty much awakened to the perspective that you have been part of a religious system, and the religious system in particular is not functional, it's not working out for you, this session here tonight in particular is actually going to be helpful to you. All of the information that we're actually going to cover here comes out of research based on the science or the physics of the human energy at the International Institute of Rheumatology, which is not only theoretical research but pragmatic and experimental research to be able to identify how the human energy works and why persons are spiritually stuck. This is actually going to be the very first time that most of you are actually going to be hearing this, unless you have been connected to the International Institute of Rheumatology in some form or fashion. But this in particular is specifically designed to give you insight into why you are actually struggling with what you're struggling with today, and how to actually stop it. Right now, if you're feeling spiritually stuck, if you're experiencing religious trauma, or if you are trying to break away from the religiosity, you are actually pretty much standing in the same place unknowingly. Just these three things are just mere varying expressions of the same struggle that you're experiencing. There's three different experiences of the same dynamic. Now, tonight, what I'm actually going to do, usually most of the times when I'm doing this, I would have a presentation just to actually show a presentation that has been prepared, with which I would just walk through these things for members of our community. And tonight I decided I would not do that. I actually decided tonight what I'm actually going to do is to pretty much engage this topic of how to break free from being spiritually stuck, from religious trauma, and from various forms of religiosity. I'm actually going to do that based on our research at the Institute. But even more so, I'm not going to be using a presentation that has been prepared. I'm actually going to pull up a site that I actually use to build presentations, and I'm actually going to build these diagrams right in front of you so that you can actually see the layers of the concepts that we're speaking about in real time. And so you can actually have an idea as to what is taking place with you in a real time construction of what you are experiencing. And we're actually going to finish this segment here today with a very practical way, basically, a very practical way of breaking free from feeling spiritually stuck. If you're experiencing religious trauma, my oh my, is this going to help you? And if you're actually trying to break free from religiosity, this is actually going to help you to be able to do it with a method and not just try and labor to break free from it. Now, usually because of the dynamics or the both the definitions as well as the way we have been taught spirituality within the Westernized Christian community, within the Westernized Christian world, because of the definitions that we have been taught and the method of spirituality that we have been familiarized with, we are all, if you fall into any one of these three categories, you would pretty much be in a very difficult position. And the reason for that is the spirituality that we are taught in the westernized world, even in the non-Christian world, all of it is usually very abstract. When I say very abstract, it is not something that is tangible. They are all spiritual ideas that you're actually holding in your mind that has some form of a shape, but not complete. And because of that, coming out of it, it's very, 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 very difficult and very, very challenging because you have not been given definitions and very clear definitions of what the spiritual concepts that you've been taught are. All you know is that you are supposed to keep certain rules or do certain things, and in lots of cases, not do certain things to be able to attain to the spiritual definition. But if I ask anyone and everyone listening to this right now, you have absolutely no clarity as to what it is you're attaining to. You just know that you're following rules of do's, and in some cases, these are the things that you need to do, which is just read your Bible, pray. And because you've been in that very abstract perspective for so long, breaking free of the abstract perspective is like trying to hold a ghost or trying to hold on to smoke and get it out of your room. And that is what we're actually going to break you free from here tonight. So, as I said, I'm actually going to build this presentation in real time for you so that you can see what is taking place with you and you can begin to make decisions. Right now, just to give you some background information, I am actually the founder of the International Institute of Pneumatology, where we actually conduct this research and have actually been conducting this experimental research. And if you don't know anything about me, I was actually part of the religious arena, right? And coming out of the religious arena, specifically the Pentecostal arena, I went to school in Catholic schools, grew up in Pentecostal household, and had contact with many different religions under the bracket or under the umbrella of Christianity. And when I came to the stark realization, not to get into my history, if you would like to know more about that, you can actually visit our community. But when I came to the realization that what I had been taught was actually not dependable, it was not something that I could depend on, that actually threw me in for a loop. And I pretty much ended up in what most people are actually calling religious trauma today. I actually identified it when I was experiencing it in 2014 into 2015. What I identified it as was an identity crisis. Now, whether you're actually feeling spiritually stuck or you're experiencing religious trauma, maybe you had some experience with people who are who were of the religious arena that you came from, and because you're actually using the religion in particular to to lend you some sort of approval, self approval or self validation. You may have encountered situations where probably a leader or a member of the circle, a member of the community, or other persons who are actually from the community who may have invalidated you amidst your labor to be validated, and it caused trauma. All right. And you came out of it in particular and you realize that this thing has been a lie, and you're actually feeling as though you're lost, you're feeling angry. There are lots of things on roller coaster rides that you go through when you go through religious trauma. Now, today in particular, it's being referred to as religious trauma. When I faced it, what I was able to do is to identify that it was an identity crisis. And when one is in an identity crisis, pretty much what you do, what happens is that you lose the anchor of your mind. You lose the anchor of your process of rationalization. You use the anchor of what you need to make decisions, and to make decisions that you can trust to be decisions that are dependable and reliable. If you come out from religious circles, you're pretty much going to be experiencing the same, just without necessarily the trauma. But you know that what you're doing is not functional. And the persons who are spiritually stuck, when you're spiritually stuck, it's actually because the logic that you're using from the religious arena, that logic that you actually give on, is not working, and you pretty much begin to lose inspiration to continue using the template that you've been taught, because you're not getting the results that you need, and you're not experiencing what you like to experience. Now, the information I'm about to divulge in here comes out of well over 40 to 50,000 hours of research at the International Institute of Pneumatology. And the International Institute of Pneumatology is dedicated to the pragmatic and experimental research of the ancient Hebrew principle of biblical literature, which has been identified as God's name. And we also are dedicated to the research as well as education on the science of human energy. Now, in this research in particular, what we have actually found is that the westernized world, and I'm not speaking about Christianity, I'm speaking about the entire westernized world, they are actually pretty much oblivious of how the human energy works. We have not really had, as a matter of fact, I can say that we are probably one of the very first institutes that have actually been able to identify what the law of the physics of the human energy is. And it is from this perspective that we're actually going to be sharing this information with you. And what I'm about to share here, we have applied to many people who've actually come from religious trauma, or came out from some form of religiosity, and have been able to help them solve their problems and even rectify many areas of their life. We have been able to identify that the law of the physics of human energy is actually a principle, which is what we refer to as a law, the principle of the self-existent, which translates into the principle of self-determination. Now, what does that mean exactly? The principle of self-determination, very simply put, means that for you to make a decision, you must have very good reason to come to a conclusion. Now, that might sound as though it's common sense, but unfortunately, you're not living from that perspective. In most cases, you actually depend on, most of us have been taught in one way or the other, whether you're from, in whichever field of life that you're actually involved in, you have been taught to use external sources of validation, external things, whether it's people, their opinions, career, academic accomplishments, social status. We can actually put up a nice long list of things that people use generally. Even if you're actually part of a religious community, you are using a list of rules or some criteria that you're using that is external of you as external compulsion, which is that you're using that to pretty much define yourself. And when that is actually threatened, the threatening of that external source of validation, which is technically You're using it as a source of definition for identity, process of rationalization, system of judgment, a logical your logical process to make decisions, even to develop your worldview. All of these things are developed by the source that you have chosen to be able to actually develop a system of intelligence from which you live. Now, the physics of the human energy means that it is self-determining, which means if it does not have sufficient reason or does not know what it is, if one does not spend time identifying what they are objectively by the nature of the human energy, the absence of that knowledge means that one naturally begins to pursue that knowledge or source of information or source of intelligence outside of the human energy to be able to define themselves. Now, for believers, and this is actually more specific to persons who are spiritually stuck, suffering from religious trauma, or trying to break free from some form of religiosity, I'm going to be narrowing this information today to these three things. So I'm not going to be speaking about in general terms. So basically, if you're actually coming from a religious community and you're experiencing any of these three things, it's because you have used your denominational circle and the rules of your denominational circle as the point of reference to be able to define yourself. All right? Which means technically you are using an external source of information. It could be the rules of the denomination that you have belonged to. You've used those to construct a mental imagery of what you look like in perfect fulfillment of this criteria. Today, psychology actually refers to this as the ego. All right. Now, some of the information that I'm about to unpack here may be a bit different for some of us who've actually been educated by the westernized system of thought, which is everybody. But our research at the Institute is actually based on ancient Hebrew thought, schools of thought, or their thought heritage. And where we have been taught in the westernized world in general, that we are body, soul, and spirit as three separate entities as one, ancient Hebrews do not believe this. They actually believe that you are spirit in a body, and the mental imagery of yourself is actually what you call your soul. These are not three separate things. The soul is simply a multiplication of your spirit that you create, and you are chasing like a carrot on a string. Now, as I said, I'm not going to be using a presentation that has been prepared. So what I'm going to do is actually build this presentation right in front of you, so it helps you understand, just not watching a screen, but putting these concepts together. Excuse me. So I'm going to remove what you're looking at on the screen, and we're going to fall back on this screen right here. Now, if you're experiencing any one of those things in particular, basically, let's just pull. Now I'm going to use the image of a man. This is not specific to gender, so please do not actually assume that this is we're using this by any gender bias. It is simply just for the sake of the example. Now imagine that this is you, right? And you are actually living from an identity. Now, if whether you're experiencing some sort of a feeling that like you're religiously stuck, you're suffering from religious trauma, you're experiencing religious trauma, or you are going, or you are trying to break free from religiosity, all three categories that you're actually looking at there are pretty much doing this. They're pretty much doing the same thing. They're actually using, let's pull this up on the screen here. So let's use a little box. All right. And we're going to put in this box, you're using religion, basically using religion to define oneself. So let's put that in religion, right? Which means that if you're using religion to define oneself, you're using a religious criteria. Let's put this up right here. Now, that means that if you are using religious criteria, pay attention to what you're looking at on your screen. If you're using this religious criteria, let's say we use this arrow here, give that a little color, and we take this arrow here and we connect you to this. Right? This means that what you are doing is that you are using religion or the religious criteria, which should be all of the rules that you have been taught to use to be able to be able to build some credibility or a sense of validation or a sense of approval before God, before the definition of God that you're taught. And if you belong to Westernized Christianity, the definition of God that you usually taught is the mental picture of this individual sitting down in the sky on clouds, looking down, right? Your mental imagery of that might shift a little bit, but generally you're actually functioning from the perspective that this person is in the clouds and you're using the religious criteria to be able to prove yourself to be righteous or holy. And you're doing that so that you can be blessed, right? You can be pleasing to God, which means the religious criteria is being used to define yourself. So technically, what you're doing is that you're using this religious criteria to be able to identify oneself. Now, in doing this, what you are literally doing is that you are building a mental imagery of yourself, literally a mental imagery of yourself based on the religious criteria. All right. Let's say that this mental imagery is this right here. All right. We give this guy a white shirt. Let's say we give him a white shirt and a white pants. And let's just assume that this is the mental imagery that you are building of yourself, right? Which is what you look like in the fulfillment of this religious criteria. Now, you can actually fill in the blanks there with regards to what the criteria in your religious denomination looks like. And you have constructed a mental imagery of what that person is supposed to look like. That means that this is the mental imagery that you're working with and you are pursuing. So technically, pay attention. You have actually this mental imagery that you've used to construct this mental imagery, that the religious criteria that you've used to construct the mental imagery is technically, let's put this on this side here. This is technically an identity that you have created. Right? And when we say identity, we're talking about an idea, a definition that you've created for yourself. Now, even though you have not sat down and written down this definition, the religious criteria is what you use as the definition. Now, when you build this identity is something in particular that you are constantly looking at. And for those of us who have actually come up in the religious arena, this identity, let me just increase the size of the screen a little bit. Yeah, if you've actually come out in the religious arena, this identity is what you are pursuing on a daily basis. Anytime you think about whether you are legitimate or you think about whether you are actually, whether you are approved or you have any form of legitimacy, you refer to this religious criteria and the imagery that you have built on this religious criteria. This identity, this religious criteria, you'll be used to define yourself. And in this identity, what you actually begin to do is to define two things that are specific to your identity. Number one, you define your potential, your life's potential, based on this religious criteria. Let's call this here your life's potential. right? And you use this criteria also to define your life's limitations. Right? And how did you do that? You use this to actually show those rules, the religious criteria of your particular denomination. You used it to be able to identify what you can do, what you're capable of, and what your limitations are. Now, in most religious circles, you were taught that you are dust, nothing more than dust, and that you can't do anything without God. Therefore, your potential is literally zero. So you pursue God because what you're really looking for is to actually maximize the potential. So you're pursuing God, and what you don't know what you don't realize that you're doing is really pursuing your identity outside of yourself. Because God is in the sky. So you're doing all of this to appease God so that you can be considered righteous. So technically, you are actually taught to pursue identity outside of yourself. So let's put identity externally. Let's put that in brackets. Therefore, you are not being self-determining. You are depending on something outside of yourself because the law of your human energy is to be self-determining. But you are not given the information to help you be self-determining. The religion in particular functions like the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden. The religious criteria are the leaves of that tree. So just as the man in the garden ate from the tree, which is you eating from the tree of religion, the religious criteria like the leaves, and just as he clothed his body with the leaves, you are clothing yourself with the criteria by working at fulfilling this criteria and using that criteria to define your potential. Therefore, your potential is limited by the religious criteria that you were taught. Now, immediately, and this is just skimming the surface, just at this point right here, you can then identify why, one, you feel spiritually stuck. Because the religious criteria has put a cap on your potential. Your potential does not exceed the religious criteria. Number two, why you're also experiencing the religious trauma and you're feeling it's very difficult to break free from the religious trauma. It's because you are technically still, for those of you experiencing religious trauma, you have been using religion all of your life or for a long period of time to define your life's potential. And even though you have identified that the religion in particular is not healthy to use, nobody has actually taught you that you have been using religion as the bar, as the reference point to define your identity, to define your life's potential and your life's limitations. So what you have been taught, or what you're doing right now, not necessarily what you've been taught, but what you're doing right now in reaction, is actually trying to free yourself from the trauma that you're experiencing, but you're using the same reference point to free yourself from the same reference point, which means technically you're using the same thing that is causing you harm to try to gain freedom from it, because you cannot see yourself further than the potential that the religion has defined for you. Right? Now, if this is making sense, please feel free to comment in the comment section. We'll look at the comments in a while. But this is basically why you are actually struggling to be free. And for those of you actually trying to break free from religiosity, again, you're using the same reference point to be able to define yourself. And even though you realize that the reference point is not, it's toxic, it's valid, it's not useful, it's not logically useful, you still have not identified that you're using this as a reference point, the religious criteria as a reference point, or the religion as a reference point, and so you have not found a new reference point. And I'll show you how to find a new reference point very soon, just in a bit. But the reason why you're feeling as though you're stuck in a religiosity is because you have not found a new reference point to find a new definition for identity. You are actually aware of the fact that it's toxic, but you're using the same thing that you're aware of to actually try to free yourself from the same definition that the reference point has given you. This is why you're stuck. The reference point, the religious criteria, also is what you also use to define your life's limitations, right? Which means it defines what you cannot do. And if you depending on how dedicated you were to this religious criteria, you would actually have more walls, mental barriers put in place that has actually become a life norm. This criteria became a life priority, became the most important thing for you because you've been using it to define yourself, define identity. And that is super important because without an identity, you cannot function. But the religious criteria actually had a list of limitations, which means that you are feeling as though you are bound because the religious criteria define your life's limitations. Now, this is not all. One of the reasons why you are actually feeling as though in these places like you are paralyzed is because of the following. And pay attention because this is actually going to help set you on the path to freedom. Right? Again, based on research at the International Institute of Hematology. So let's bring in another box here where I'm going to list 4 things that you are experiencing that you don't know you're experiencing as yet because not even psychology has these answers. Right? But that's a separate conversation. So the first thing that you actually use religious criteria to do is to use as a reference point or to use as the most important thing that you reference to be able to make decisions. Right? Every single thing that you have done in your life, you have used religion as the point of comparison to be able to decide what decisions to make. Now, as I said, I'm keeping this specific to the religious arena because if you're not from the religious arena, then you've been doing the same thing with another reference point. Some people might use career, some people might use academic accomplishment, some people may use money, some people may use possessions. These are common things that people use in our society. But if you come from the religious arena, you definitely know that you use the religious criteria to do these things. The first is to be able to make decisions. And that means that anytime an opportunity arose, the first thing that you did was compare the opportunity to the religious criteria. And if the criteria in particular was actually being contravened, you felt a sense of guilt. Your conscience didn't allow you to actually embrace the opportunity because the religious criteria set your potential and your limitations. So you began to use the criteria to be able to make decisions. Right? If this is beginning to resonate with you, please feel free to comment in the comment section. So you're using this to make decisions. You're using this to know whether to make a decision or not, whether to make a decision as an affirmative, that you're going to follow up on this. You're making a decision in the direction of an affirmative, or you're going to make a decision in the direction of a negative. You're going to actually accept or decline. All of your life, you have been taught to use religion to make that decision for you. And some of you are actually feeling spiritually stuck because you're using, again, you actually identified that this thing is toxic. This is not logical to use it. And you're thinking, well, I feel stuck, or I still feel the trauma of my experience, or you're still feeling like you're struggling to break free from the religiosity, all because you're using the same source that you have identified as oppressive to you. You're using the same source to liberate you. But the source is already predetermined. It predetermines your potential and your limitations. So you're struggling to make decisions that are contrary, that will contradict the religious perspective because you have not found a new reference point to begin to define things. You're still in inadvertently using the religious criteria to be able to make these decisions. The second thing in particular that you are actually been using religion or the religious criteria to do is to develop a process of rationalization. Right? This is actually something that most people are actually involved in, but they have literally no idea that they have been using religious criteria to rationalize life. Which means, for example, you see something taking place by your neighbor, within your home, with a friend, see something on social media, and you use the knowledge, the religious knowledge that you have, to rationalize what is taking place. Some of us in particular may have been taught, well, these are the signs that you see. Here's an example. I'm actually giving you an example here. Some of us were taught that these are the things that you would see before the world comes to an end. And so some of us have actually been programmed to use eschatology as your process of rationalization, which means that you are not in any form or fashion watching a situation for what it is to help yourself or to help anyone. Eschatology, you have actually been, if you're using eschatology as the, let's say, the lens, the spectacle, the scope, the peephole that you are viewing what you're seeing through, and you cannot help but rationalize using end time eschatology to be able to define or to be able to understand what is taking place. Right? Again, if this makes sense, feel free to type in the comment section, because this here has actually caused you to be stuck, and you're pretty much, again, feeling religious, if you're feeling spiritually stuck, simply because you have realized that this process of rationalization, even though you may not have been able to put your finger on it and define it as a process of rationalization, you know that it is actually dysfunctional, but you do not have another source to be able to rationalize through. So you feel stuck. Some of you in particular are experiencing religious trauma. You are actually feeling as though you're stuck in religious trauma and you don't know how the heck to get out of it, simply because you have identified accurately that you are experiencing trauma, because trauma is pretty much the invalidation. Any type of trauma is actually another way of saying that you were invalidated by a trusted source, and that trusted source betrayed your trust. And because you use the source to define yourself, when the source invalidated you, it took away your identity and it left you virtually mentally and emotionally paralyzed and powerless, because you depend on an identity to mobilize. You depend on an identity to develop a system of intelligence, which is what we're talking about here. So some of you are stuck in religious trauma because you've accurately identified that you have been a victim of invalidation, identity invalidation, as a result of using this as a criteria, but you have not been taught or have not been told that you need to change your life priority to be able to have a different process of rationalization. Instead, what most people are taught who are actually experiencing religious trauma is that you need to go through a process of deconstruction. And even though that process of deconstruction sounds logical, it's detrimental, because a process of deconstruction without a new reference point of rationalization means that you are trying to deconstruct the same criteria that you're using, that you once used. You've identified it as toxic, but your process of process of deconstruction is pretty much using the same thing that has traumatized you as the reference point to deconstruct it, which means you are not deconstructing, you are further confirming the criteria in your heart, in your mind, in your subconscious mind. You are further with what people call the subconscious mind. You are further concreting it. Now, if you have been going through a process of deconstruction, this is your SOS. You are not helping yourself. You are sinking yourself deeper into the hole. If you understand, once you understand what it means to change a reference point for the reference point for definition of identity, to change your life priority and use a new life priority, you realize that the process of deconstruction is not necessary one bit. Because basically what you're going to be doing in a very practical way is the same thing as somebody changing professions, life professions. Somebody may have spent their life being an architect and they realize the field of architecture is not lucrative, and decided to go and find a field that is lucrative, and decide, okay, I'm going to become an engineer. You do not spend time deconstructing architecture before moving across to the engineering field. If you're deconstructing architecture, you're technically confirming the architecture and concreting it even more. Because what you are most aware of, that is what you're using to build your identity. Your awareness of architecture in the process of deconstruction is technically confirming the information and the knowledge. Instead, what you do is that you abandon architecture and you begin to study engineering. And your consistent awareness of engineering causes you to now define your life, an identity through the engineering. If you're using that as an identity, I would recommend that you don't, but just for the sake of the example, you use the engineering to define your identity. You use engineering to define your life's potential and limitations. And then you begin to use it to make decisions, to develop a process of rationalization, and the other 2 points that we are actually going to be covering. And that awareness of that causes the knowledge of the architecture to become a distant memory. This is the same thing that is necessary to free yourself from religious trauma. Unfortunately, the field of our research at the International Institute of Pneumatology has actually helped us to be able to identify this and help many, but it is not common knowledge in the world today. The third thing in particular that you actually use this reference point, and you've been taught to use religion or the religious criteria to do, is to develop a system of judgment. Right? A system of judgment that you use to be able to judge yourself as to whether the decision that you're making, when I say system of judgment, you're using it basically to confirm your identity or not. So you're going to judge every action that you're going to take, every action that you see, and you're also going to judge situations, and more detrimental to your relationships is that you use the religious criteria to judge people in your lives, to judge the public, to judge your family, to judge your spouse, to judge your children, to judge your friends, your acquaintances, your neighbors. You're using the religious criteria to judge them, which means you are technically using the religious criteria to validate or invalidate them. Now, when you actually identify that, okay, on the case that you're spiritually stuck because you have not used a new reference point to develop a system of judgment. So you feel stuck because you're still struggling with using the religious criteria you're still struggling from preventing yourself. You're still struggling with preventing yourself from using the religious criteria to judge others. Now, a very common mistake most people use in this case is technically using broad concepts to develop a system of judgment, process of rationalization, or to be able to make decisions. And some people might say, okay, just show love. And even the concept of love that they actually experience or they're actually using has no defined parameters. So technically, if your definition is not properly defined, and most people use love in the context of kindness and affection. And if you use something that one-sided, particularly to define what love is, you are actually going to find yourself in very uncomfortable situations very quickly, because the definition, if it is just based on a value like kindness and something physical like affection, that means that you will actually look, and this is a big mistake that most people find themselves in, where persons are not being kind to them, they assume it is not love, and where the persons are not being very gentle and affectionate with them, they assume it is not love. The problem with that is that if you're dealing with somebody who has the potential to cause great harm to you, once they are kind to you, you will overlook your intuition that this person can take your life. Or if they become affectionate with you, you will overlook the intuition that you're feeling, validate them as safe, and place oneself in the position of being seriously harmed. Using broad concepts like love without proper definition is what most people use to free themselves, but end up putting themselves in great situations where their safety can be compromised mentally, physically, sexually, emotionally. The last thing that I want to mention here that you're actually also using to develop, you're using religious criteria, you have used religious criteria to develop, is a worldview, right? Which means you see the world through the religious criteria. And if you take a look around right now, you notice that most people that come from religious circles, they can't help but develop a worldview. And the worldview that they actually hold to is very commonly things that related to end of the world, the Antichrist, tribulation, destruction, and viewing the entire world through the criteria, religious criteria, which means if the world is not following the religious criteria, they have been you are taught to view them through the perspective of, well, they are invalidated, they're going to be judged, and they will die. Now, these four things in particular are just a mere expansion of using the identity to define your life's potential and life's limitations. And because you have not changed the criteria which you have used to build this imagery of yourself that we're talking about here, most of you are stuck spiritually, because to be unstuck means that you need to have a new definition of what you're looking at, or a different reference point, a different life priority, to actually develop or to have a new template, a new system of logic to apply to get results. You are stuck because you realize that this is not working, but you don't have a new template to apply, a new definition. For those of you suffering from religious trauma, you're stuck because you use religious criteria to define these things, and you're trying to either, number one, deconstruct, or number two, you're trying to free yourself from your awareness of this. But the only way to free oneself from an awareness is to find a different awareness, to free yourself from one particular awareness. And you have not been taught that. So every day you're actually thinking about your religion and how it has affected you. But what you're not doing is also searching out a trusted reference point to be able to actually redefine your identity, to redefine your potential, to redefine even your limitations, depending on what you're actually going to use. And I'll make a suggestion for you. Also, to redefine what you use to make decisions, to redefine your process of rationalization, to redefine a system of judgment, and to redefine your worldview. And for those of you stuck in religiosity, you are in the same position, because the common factor is here, you are not finding, or you are not redefining what you have been using, or you have not found a new life priority. Now, at the International Institute of Pneumatology, what we have actually found is that if you are one of those persons have actually identified yourself with being religiously stuck, spiritually stuck, experiencing religious trauma, or you've been using or you feel as though you are stuck in the world of religiosity and you can't find yourself out of it. We have actually found, so if you're experiencing one of those three things and you still desire to actually still believe in God, you don't want to leave the idea of God, but you know that what you're experiencing is not right, then what I'm about to show you here is going to help you out tremendously and actually give you an idea as to how you go about starting to break free completely from feeling spiritually stuck, experiencing religious trauma, and or freeing yourself from the world of religiosity. Now, if you still want to believe in God, then one of the things in particular that I would actually encourage you to do is to consider the following. So let me just consider the following, right? So I'm going to remove this guy. If you still desire to believe in God, but you know that the religion is not for you, then basically one of the things in particular that I encourage you to consider is going to write this. No, this is actually not deleted. It's still on the first slide. I'm just creating a new slide and just rewriting on it on the new slide. So one of the things in particular that you want to consider is that there is nothing wrong with you. Let's just put that on it. Let's just put that on the table immediately. There is nothing that is actually wrong with you. Nothing wrong with you. You are not fractured. You're not broken. What you are just what is happening is simply that you are simply trapped. Right? You're simply trapped in what you're experiencing, and this is probably the first time that you're actually coming to an understanding as to what you're experiencing, to be able to make decisions to come out of what you're experiencing. So the first thing we want to actually identify here is there is nothing wrong with you. Stop thinking that there's something wrong with you. All right. Secondly, that if you still want to believe in God, then one of the things in particular I encourage you to consider, and I'm going to write it on the screen, is that you may have used Christian religion to define the Bible. And unfortunately, because of the inculcation of the Westernized Christian community, we may have actually never considered that the biblical literature, let's put biblical literature, predates Christianity. That's probably now hitting your mind as I just said it. Biblical literature predates Christianity. What do I mean by that? One of the things in particular that I encourage you to even research is that biblical literature came into the hands of the Greco-Roman society. The Greco-Roman society did not write the biblical literature. They did not write the Old Testament, nor did they write the New Testament. The literature pretty much fell into the hands of the Greco-Roman society. And as it fell into the hands of the Greco-Roman society, they assumed the authority to interpret what it said. But biblical literature predates Christianity. Why am I saying this? Because what I want you to consider is that Westernized Christianity, or what we know as modern Christianity, despite the denominational circle that you have come from, they therefore do not have the authority or the final authority to say what the literature means or to interpret it for you. If it fell into their hands, then naturally you want to consider that the authors are the authors of the texts are the ones that have the authority to determine what the scripture actually means and what it is referring to. Is this making sense? And if you go back at the International Institute of Pneumatology, this is actually one of the things that we came into an awareness of. And what we did is that we actually formulated a series of experiments, well over 700 experiments, testing the typical westernized Christian doctrine, practical experiments, and we had 0 to 5% maximum, if 5% at all. We had 5% manifestation. When I say manifestation, actually creating an experiment to apply the doctrinal perspectives of the westernized Christian community. And at the Institute, apply these things into practical experiments and had 0 to 5% manifestation. It showed us that what we are actually believing in our westernized Christian community was either very fabricated or very heavily misguided, because it was not yielding spiritual results or spiritual manifestation. In our process, we actually then turned, after about 2 years of consistent bombardment of the doctrines with practical experiments, hoping to get results. After 2 years of doing that, we then turned our eyes to the Jewish community, the modern-day Jewish community. And to our surprise, we realized that they had a lot of answers with regards to what some of the things meant in the scriptures. But over time, we actually realized that they shared some of the westernized perspectives. And when I say westernized perspectives, please understand that I'm not referring to the Americas when I say westernized. I'm speaking about the Greco-Roman society, civilization, Greco-Roman way of thinking. And one of the things that separates the Greco-Roman way of thinking from the biblical authors is that we think through a very abstract way of thought. We have a very abstract system of thought. What do I mean by that? It means that most of the things that we speak about, we use emotion to pretty much give us an idea as to what it means, like strength. If I actually say, draw strength on a piece of paper to 100 persons in a room, 100 persons may draw 100 different things because their definition of strength, because it is not something that is actually referring to something physical or tangible that everybody could reference, you use your emotion to try to define what strength is. If I say love, that's another concept that is not defined in our Greco-Roman society. It's an abstract concept, which means you use emotional content to try to define it. Peace, same thing. Leadership, same thing. We can just talk about all of these westernized perspectives, and it's very abstract. It's something that is very philosophical in nature, something that is not related to anything tangible. What we found was that the Jewish community today have a lot of abstract perspectives involved in their interpretation of the Bible. And as we looked further, what we realized is one of the very renowned rabbinic rabbis, or one of the rabbis that actually is pretty much the father of one of the predominant schools of thought. His name is Maimonides. We found that Maimonides, when he lived, he actually interfaced with a lot of Greek philosophers and Islamic philosophers. And in an attempt to try to get along with them, he began to incorporate their perspectives into biblical interpretation. So naturally, that caused us to go back to the actual authors, the civilization of the actual authors of the scriptures. And those would be ancient prophets. Now you have the ancient Hebrews, who had their own culture, but amongst the ancient Hebrews, you had ancient Israelite prophets. And these ancient Israelite prophets dedicated themselves to a particular worldview that is actually based on the name of God. They actually live as a paradigm in the Garden of Eden. So we had to direct our attention to them, and we realized that the ancient Israelite prophets are the ones who we should actually take our understanding of scripture from. And after well over 40 to 50,000 hours of both theoretical research, being able to identify the ancient philosophy of thought and the philosophy of the language, then putting that to practical experiments, and we had well over 80% manifestation by understanding the ancient Israelite prophetic perspective, because they are the authors of the texts. It is on that note that I'm actually saying that the biblical literature predates Christianity. And if you are someone who is actually feeling spiritually stuck, experiencing religious trauma, and trying to break free of religiosity, one of the biggest mistakes that you can be making is actually that you're judging the literature through the lens of Christianity. When the literature came into the hands of Christianity, Christianity did not write the literature. The only persons in particular that you should actually be looking at to give you a definition of what the scripture looks like or what the scriptures actually mean would be the ancient Israelite prophets. Right? The ancient Israelite prophetic perspective of the scriptures is what Jesus actually took on as his own, because he was actually the one that both the Apostle Peter as well as James indicated that he was the one that Moses spoke about that would come after him. And therefore, by the law of reproduction after one's own kind, he took on the prophetic understanding of the scriptures from the prophets. Right? And prophets were also priests. So to say priestly perspective of the scriptures would be the same thing as saying the prophetic perspective of the scriptures. Is this making sense? Right? And the third thing that I would actually encourage you to consider is the ancient prophets in particular. Let's write that in there. The ancient prophets are the ones that you should take interpretation from, not Christianity. Right? Now, having said that, I can give you more reasons, but we are not about to actually try to spend 3 hours here. This is actually going to be meant to be a very short session, and we're already on the 60-minute marker. So then the next question is, what in our research did we find to actually help you? What we found was that the ancient, there's a difference. Let's just duplicate this page again. Third page. Difference between Christianity and ancient prophets in biblical understanding. Primary difference. Let's just reduce the size a little bit so it can fit into the box. All right, there's a difference. What's the difference? The first difference is Christianity actually taught you that you are nothing. Start with. Christianity actually taught you that you are nothing. Ancient prophets actually do not teach that you are nothing. They use the Garden of Eden as a reference point to define everything in the scriptures. Ancient prophets actually teach that when God created man, God gave man his name, his breath and his name. Right? The breath in the ancient Hebrew culture, God gave man his very own breath. In the ancient Hebrew culture, the breath of God is the name of God. Therefore, when God breathed the breath of life into the dust, God breathed the name of God, his name, into the dust. And therefore, the man in the garden was actually Adam. That's the name of the actual physicality of the being, but the identity came from the breath or the spirit of the man. And his spirit was Yahweh Elohim. You can read Isaiah 43 for confirmation on that, as well as other scriptures that I'm not going to, this is not a Bible class, so I'm not going to be giving all of that here. There's another main difference in particular, is that You were taught by Christianity. Christianity taught serve God was to appease the God in the sky for blessings. Ancient prophetic, ancient prophets they do not even know what that is or what that means. They serve God by ancient prophets teach service to God by taking on God's name as your own and exercising his authority in the earth. Which means that the authors actually teach the polar opposite of what we have been taught in westernized Christianity. So basically, prophets, ancient prophets, which is why you notice that when the prophets actually they step into the role of a prophet, they would say, "Thus says the Lord," which is translated "Thus says the Lord" is a translation of "Thus says Yahweh," and then they speak in first person singular. "I will bless you and I will exalt you," because they are actually taking on God's name as their own, which is actually mirroring and reflecting how God created man to be in the Garden of Eden. And they speak in the cognitive law of the name, because the name is actually a principle of function and a psychology. The name is its own psychology. So they would actually take on the name Yahweh as their own. And because Yahweh means he's self-existent and eternal, they have a self-existent way of thinking, which goes back to the garden. In the garden, man was created to function self-existently, which is to use his own spirit as his source of validation. And then he was tricked by the serpent to use something outside of himself as a source of validation, as in the capacity of his spirit. And that is what we have been encountered in our Western Christianity. We have been taught the outside the garden perspective, where you are using religious criteria to give you that source of validation, whilst ancient prophets teach that obviously that Yeshua came and put that identity to death. And now you are actually the prophets, the apostles were given the charge to go preach the gospel, which is the good news that Jesus has actually given you the new breath, which is the breath that was in the garden. And now you return to self-existent living, which is using your human energy, which is the God energy, the spirit of God in you, as your reference point to define yourself. The name of that breath, the name of that spirit in you is Yahweh Elohim. And therefore, you have a multiplication of Elohim, just like the prophets take on the name, walk out, and you begin to live according to the psychology of that name. Self-existent way of living, and no longer codependent identity, but the function from self-existent identity. Is this making sense? All right. So you're probably asking, okay, if this makes sense, then what does that look like? And this is the last thing that I'm going to show you here now. Right. So what do I do in this case to begin to break free? What do I do to begin to break free, Zane? First thing that you need to do is to identify now this is for those who still desire to believe in God. What we are actually now presenting you with, or actually making an offer to you with, is to actually introduce you to the ancient prophetic perspective, which is Jesus's perspective of the scriptures, as well as not only Jesus's perspective of the scriptures, but also the apostles' perspective of the scriptures. So how do you do this? This is where, let's say we take this right here. The same things that we spoke about here, what you basically need to do is to use your spirit to define these things. So let's remove this. Start there. Rah. And let's say we just duplicate this guy right here. right? And we give him a white shirt, a white pants, right? Nice. So technically, this represents your spirit, the white aspect of this diagram right here. Which means, what do you do? What do I do to begin to break free? Instead of using religious criteria, which was this right here, whichever denominational circle you came from, to build this identity and develop this mental imagery of what you would look like based on the religious criteria, and you began to pursue this and pursue this without exhaustion until you got exhausted, until you were hurt, until you felt like this is not working and you're just stuck. What you simply need to do is to start by redefining what you think you know. Right now, I showed you the differences here with regards to some of the things Christianity taught in comparison to the authors of the scriptures. What you basically need to do is to begin to even redefine what God is. Not what Christianity taught you, but what did the ancient prophets teach God to be? And one of the things in particular is that the God, the word Yahweh Elohim, we have been taught as the label of a particular entity in the clouds. Redefining your belief system according to the ancient prophets and what Jesus and the apostles knew is that the name Yahweh Elohim is not only a label, it's a title that you can take on as your own that teaches you how to think, which means Yahweh means self-existent and eternal. You begin to think self-existently and eternally and think from authority and power. That means you are no longer pursuing identity. You're living from the identity of the title of your spirit. Your spirit is called Yahweh Elohim, which is also referred to as Christ Jesus or the Holy Ghost. So technically, you're no longer pursuing your identity. You're functioning from the identity of your own spirit, which is what baptism meant in the first place. Christianity taught that baptism is just being submerged in water. In the Old Testament, Jesus, the apostles, they saw baptism as changing your name. That is even in the English dictionary, but it is not taught in Christianity. To change your name means that you abandon the title, the name that you've given yourself, which is the name that you build all this codependent identity from, and come back to the title of your species, the title of your spirit, which is Yahweh Elohim, and just adopt the cognitive law of your spirit and step into supernatural life. Now, once you're using your spirit as the cognitive law, let's just bring this forward. Once you're using your spirit, basically, as Yahweh Elohim, as a reference point to begin to define your identity, then you are now stepping into God identity, which is you are Elohim. This is actually seen in the Bible, which is Psalm 82. Christianity taught that you were dust. Then you use that title and that identity to define your life potential, which means anything God can do, you have the potential to do. Does God have limitations? Yes, he cannot break his word. Then you become a trustworthy individual. You only speak that which you can validate, and you do not commit to things that you're not serious about. You also begin to use the name, the cognitive law, to be able to make decisions, which means you live from the definition of what you are to make decisions, which means you are a life giver, you are a creator. So you use that to make decisions. You develop a process of rationalization, which means you use your spirit to tell you what to do, which means if your spirit has the potential, it's intelligent, then you rationalize things via intelligence and not blind faith. You use your spirit to develop a system of judgment, which means you identify everything as spirit. And therefore, if you identify everything as spirit and a multiplication of your spirit, then you do not have biases to yourself or to others. Because we are all spirit, then we are all equal, and therefore you live naturally and effortlessly from a perspective of equity. And you develop a worldview. In your worldview, even though there are things that are taking place in the world, you always use the potential of your spirit to live from, which means no matter how grim it looks, You are a creator and you continue to create to help others as well as yourself as a collective. And you no longer live from the perspective of just trying to secure your journey to heaven and things like that. All right? So basically, if you want to continue to walk in God, this information is present today. Right? You're probably asking, so how have I not heard of this? Right? The International Institute of Pneumatology has been actually founded in the year 2019 with at least 4 years of research prior to its official establishment. But all of this information and well over 40,000 hours of research, 50, we're actually at 50, but I usually say 40,000 hours to stay in the integrity because I don't walk around with the figures in my mind. But we are actually over 50,000 hours now of research that not only gives you this information, but we are now able, at the Institute, we are now able to actually redefine the entire scriptures through the name of God and the cognitive law of the name of God. And you will actually see that what you've been taught in Christianity and what the ancient prophets' perspective of the scriptures is and what it is communicating to you has absolutely nothing with what you've been taught in Westernized Christianity. So if this information in particular seems like something that you would like to explore, I would encourage you to come look for us. Right? We are the International Institute of Pneumatology. That's on your screen there for you. And you can actually, no, let's not put that there. You can actually find us on our website at www.internationalinstituteofpneumatology.com. Right there, you will find all of the links that you're looking for to connect with us on social media, to find our YouTube channel, which is, I'm just going to leave the YouTube channel at the bottom here. Let's search for @Anointed Life. You'll find our YouTube channel. Let's pretty it up a little bit and put in our YouTube logo here. All right, for those of you asking, what am I using to do this? This is actually Canva. If you want to actually do some nice little graphics like this, presentations, images, you can use Canva, like I'm using here right now. Find us on YouTube, Anointed Life, or International Institute of Pneumatology.com. All right, at that website, you'll find links. And if by chance, some of you in particular would like to actually start your journey to break free from feeling spiritually stuck, to break free from not only feeling spiritually stuck, but break free from religious trauma and finally make your way out of it. If this information makes sense to you and you would like to free yourself from the religious trauma that we have been speaking about, then I would encourage you to actually search for a Facebook group. Well, you can actually go to what I was saying, go to the International Institute of Pneumatology.com and find the link and find the relevant links. But you can also come to this particular group on Facebook, Freedom from Religiosity and Religious Trauma. Search for this in your Facebook bar, the Sacred Keys of the Ancient Prophets. This is a new community that we have formed for any and everybody who is feeling spiritually stuck, who's actually experiencing religious trauma and would like to break free from it completely and immediately. We can help you do that based on our research on how your energy and your human energy works, by helping you through this information we're covering here, I help you identify what your spirit is and begin to help you use your spirit as your new life priority and release yourself naturally, effortlessly, by switching life priority and beginning to define yourself from your spirit, your very own spirit, which carries God's name according to the prophets. All right. So in this group, you can learn the ancient and sacred keys of the prophets. All right. That name also is a cognitive law that helps you actually see life very differently from spirit to the world and not using things in the world to compare the rest of the world to. That name also brings you into the entering into the Garden of Eden to begin to live from the garden again, freeing yourself from all of these mental health issues, all of these, the anger and the panic and the fear and the depression, the rage that you're feeling. This is definitely going to help you be free from that. And nothing that you're actually going to encounter in this group is actually not experimentally proven. We have experimentally proven it, and you will actually be, we actually have taken all of this, even with respect to taking your new life priority and redefining yourself, redefining your system, the way you make decisions, your process of rationalization, your system of judgment, your worldview. We have over the last 7 years been able to put these things into frameworks, having experimentally proven the rational or the process of rationalization of the name as a cognitive law. And so we provide you with this in this community so that you can just take it, begin to implement it, and start your freedom from feeling spiritually stuck, from religious trauma, and breaking away from religiosity. Right? This community actually is actually a community that comes with a monthly membership of just $7. And think about it, $7 in comparison to over 50,000 hours of research. We are actually doing this for you just as a let's say I can safely say that we're doing this to give back. We have not really charged great amounts for this, but this is an opportunity for us to actually help people who actually need the information. And we're just doing this for just $7 a month, where we just start by actually showing you what you've been taught in a little more detail than this presentation and begin to redefine that for you through the ancient prophets so you can make a clean break. And it'll be a community of people where you can gather and do that process together. You're not alone with persons who are of the same mind that are there, and you all can actually foster and form new friendships with persons who are actually on the same journey, guided by well-researched content. All right. So if this is actually something that you're interested in, you know where to find us, internationalinstituteofpneumatology.com or YouTube channel at Anointed Life. All right. On that note, this brings me to the end of this little chat here with you all here today. I trust that this has been helpful. And I encourage if you know anyone in particular that would benefit from this content and from this information, please share it with those who you know that would benefit from it. It is life-changing. We have actually been able to identify how the human energy works and now walk you through a methodical process to set you free from what you're actually bound in. This cannot be found anywhere else on the internet. It cannot be found in the field of psychology, but it can be found at the International Institute of Pneumatology. Find us on Facebook, Sacred Creeds of the Ancient Prophets, or internationalinstituteofpneumatology.com, and let's get it on. Blessings and much love. Huge shout out to Stephen Buscher on LinkedIn. And for those of you who joined us on Facebook, I'm not seeing any comments here because obviously I think StreamYard still has some issues with the connectivity. So I will see your comments when I get back to Facebook. If you did comment, huge shout out to you. And for those of you who didn't comment, shout out for viewing. All right. Blessings and much love. Boom.